Today was Food Day all across America. In big city and small town, there were seminars and rallies, gardens planted, diets revised, policies argued. In Rochester, New York, there was a food stamp outreach program. In St. Louis, a phone-a-thon to answer consumer questions. In Boston, a food awareness fair. And in Arcadia, California, a good food vending machine was introduced. All of this designed to focus attention on the food we buy, grow, consume, and waste. And tonight, for the next 2 hours, here on public television, we too will attempt to shed some revealing light on the subject. The relationship of our food to our health. Why we have hunger in the midst of golden abundance. And why we pay a great deal more for food, even as we grow a great deal more. Certain things are clear. Food is power, to quote Agriculture Secretary Butts. It also is our richest resource and increasingly expensive. In the last 2 years, retail food prices are up 33%. Americans spend 20 cents of every dollar earned at the supermarket, on the average. And yet, we have no clear-cut food policy in this land. For all of the affluence of our society, we exist in a wasteland of junk foods and pop foods. We enjoy the best food that money can buy and the worst food that money can buy. We have more nutritional poverty than real poverty. We overeat and we undereat, and we pay the price in medical bills that top $30 billion a year. There are other more startling facts. Almost 1 of every 10 Americans subsists on government food stamps. Elsewhere, 480 million of the world's population go to bed hungry. And United Nations figures show that 15,000 persons die each day of malnutrition. Because food is indeed power and life, we're having what we symbolically call the last American supper here in our Washington studios. It's a dinner attended by 8 Americans, each involved with some important facet of food and food policy. The foods they're having represent a particular point of view, a part of the overall food problem. Here is John Kramer, special counsel to the House Agriculture Committee, an expert on hunger and former director of the National Council on Hunger and Malnutrition, a man who's helped draft laws to provide more money for the needy. Jim Hightower from Texas, chief of the Washington-based public interest Agribusiness Accountability Project, which keeps an eye on corporate power in the food industry. Bill Tatum, president of the Sugar Industries Trade Association, one of the major food industry groups, an authority on a wide range of industry problems and policies. Carol Foreman, executive director of the Consumer Federation of America, an advocate for consumer causes, who spends much of her time testifying on Capitol Hill and before federal agencies. Clayton Yeiter, Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, a man who knows just about everything there is to know about farming, a one-time cattle rancher from Nebraska, the administrator for the government's domestic farm programs. Richard Schweiker, the junior senator from Pennsylvania, a Republican member of Congress for 14 years, a member of the Senate's Special Committee on Nutrition, also the Subcommittee on Health. Mark Hegstead, biochemist, a professor of nutrition at Harvard. As scholar and scientist, Dr. Hegstead has been a consultant to World Health Organizations and the National Institute of Health, one of the most respected nutrition experts in the country. Michael Jacobson, a food activist, a chemist and microbiologist, co-director of the Center for Science in the Public Interest here in Washington, the man who promoted Food Day. And last, but certainly not least, my colleague Jim Lara, also concerned about the subject of food. And now, let's join them.
Well, first, lady and gentlemen, I notice that all of you are eating different things, and there's a very good reason for that. Dr. Hegstead, you're being served your main entree now. Tell us what you're eating and why, please, sir.
Well, I understood that this was the last American supper, and I ordered the last American supper. If most of you went out to dinner tonight, you'd order something very comparable to what I had. And one thing we have to remember is that people eat what they like to eat. Mm-hmm. And dietary advice that ignores that is not going to be very useful. But also, diet of this kind is related to the major causes of death in the United States: heart disease, diabetes.
Roast beef, baked potato. I mean that.
Well, it's high in cholesterol and high in saturated fat. Shrimp have cholesterol. The cheese and milk and beef and are high in saturated fat and cholesterol. It's low in vegetable fiber. Mm-hmm. And this is associated with obesity, heart disease, and increasing evidence that it's associated with a lot of the cancer that occurs in the United States.
But it sure does taste good, unfortunately.
It tastes very
right?
good.
All right, let's skip Paul. You've got a mouthful of food, Paul. We'll skip you and go to Dr. Jacobson. Tell us about your delicious-looking food there and why.
Well, I guess I ordered a low-grade version of Dr. Hegstead's dinner. My food, which is a hot dog wrapped in bacon on a nice white Wonder Bread bun and a bottle of soda pop, is my last American supper. We just can't afford to eat this food anymore. This is just sugar and water, little carbon dioxide in there. There's almost as much protein in the bun as there is in these hot dogs here. Hot dogs are very high in fat. Potato chips are rather high in fat. Bacon is very high in fat. Ordered a little applesauce here, very high in sugar. And I'm not going to eat any of it tonight.
You just going to sit there and look at it all night?
And contemplate obesity, tooth decay, heart disease, bowel cancer, some of the diseases Dr. Hegstead referred to.
You're a strong man indeed, Doctor.
I may borrow some of the other people's food, though.
Okay. Senator Schweiker, in your senatorial wisdom, what did you choose to eat tonight, sir?
Well, I picked several things that of themselves probably have some pretty good nutritional value, but I've added one ingredient that's a favorite. I have a sugar bowl, the American sugar bowl in front of me, and I start out because I don't like sour tasting grapefruit, so I obviously put some sugar there. I got to put some sugar in my iced tea because I don't like the taste of tea, but I sure like the taste of water with sugar in it. And I stir that up, and I also have some candied sweet potatoes because I like a little bit of sugar there, and I have some ham that's obviously sugared with its sauce, and some raisins and pineapples, and I have some salad that has some candied fruit in, and wait till you see my cake a la mode.
Oh, brother. Senator Schweiker, being the brilliant reporter that I am, I would deduce that you have a thing about sugar. Is that right?
Well, I think too many Americans do. We've risen from 20 to 30 pounds of sugar a year to maybe 100 to 125 pounds of sugar a year. And if you look at some of the other diseases, cavities of kids, diabetes, and other studies, you realize that some other things have risen. And so I think it's a time to go slow with American sugar consumption.
All right, let's move to Carol Foreman. You represent the consumers. You have a consumer meal there, Ms. Foreman?
Well, I have something that consumers see a lot of. You've all seen all these things before because all of these things are advertised very highly on television especially, but all through the media. And as a result, they're very expensive. I think maybe one of the things I'll tell you about is Hamburger Helper. Hamburger Helper is made by General Mills. It's a box that's got other boxes inside of it, and one of the boxes inside of it has noodles, and one of the boxes inside of it has spices. There's no meat in it. You have to buy that separately. It costs about $1.50 a pound, and you could make it for about 50 cents a pound. They spent about $3 million in 1973 to advertise Hamburger Helper. And Tang, I've got Tang. That cost 87 cents for this bottle, and they spent a couple of $1 million to advertise it. It's the most highly advertised item of General Foods. And if you wonder why Tang costs 87 cents for that, well, it might be because there are 45 directors and officers of General Foods, and they earn $3.7 million.
Moving right along, Ms. Thorne. I can hardly wait till you get to your entree there. Tell us.
Well, no, I think I'll skip it because it's shake and bake chicken, and you've all heard of that. I'd hate to pass up the opportunity to talk about salad crispins because these are breadcrumbs.
All right.
And they cost 58 cents, and that makes them cost $3.78 a pound. Breadcrumbs and a little seasoning. I think
your point being that we buy what we see, what is advertised for us to buy? Or?
I'm saying that American food is expensive in large part because it pays American corporations to process that food as highly as possible and to advertise it as highly as possible.
And that's one of the major things we want to talk about during the course of the evening, and we'll get back. Jim Hightower, in addition to being a native of Denison, Texas, you're also in the accountability field. Tell us about your accountability dinner.
This is not only maybe the last American dinner, but I think it may be the future American dinner that I'm trying to explain here, and that is the rise of monopoly power in the food economy and how that's getting us further away from the farm and away from farmers at least, and into new industrial conglomerates. I could serve you an entree, appetizer here rather, of mushrooms and bacon. And you might see these brands in your supermarket and all, but those mushrooms are made by Clorox Corporation today, and that bacon is made by IT&T, the largest conglomerate in the world. Fresh fruits and vegetables, for example, are being totally taken over by the monopoly power, by conglomerate power. This could be lettuce from Dow Chemical. These could be tomatoes from Gulf and Western. This carrots and artichoke could be from Tenneco, an oil conglomerate. That kind of power is what is loose. And this chicken entree that I'm going to have here, I have one here that is a frozen corporate product that is made by the likes of Greyhound Corporation, by Cargill Corporation, by Holly Farms, and these sort of firms that are beginning to take over the chicken industry and have in fact nationalized our food supply. So that today the average chicken that you buy in the supermarket has to travel 1,200 miles to get there, instead of as this fresh piece of chicken that I have that I was able to buy at a farmer's market right here, which will be a better tasting piece of chicken and a cheaper piece of chicken, which is grown here locally.
John Kramer, you have a delicious looking meal there before you. Tell us about it, please, sir.
Well, while everybody else was enjoying their shrimp, I was eating nothing. I can't afford it. Two reasons. One, I'm a living example of malnutrition and of Dr. Hegsted's problem. I don't want to die too early. Second of all, theoretically, my dinner is an amalgam of the kinds of things that poor people eat, and I couldn't afford it because Clayton Yoider's Department of Agriculture didn't give me enough money to buy dinner. The food stamps that he purveys give me about 24 cents a meal to the average American per meal. And this meal that I have in front of me, which is somewhat eclectic, it's beans and rice, which are pretty good on protein when balanced, hot dogs, which have all the bad things that Mike said, and I better eat them, potato salad, which adds to the carbohydrates, and dog food, which may or may not be eaten by the poor, could cost at least 50 cents a serving, or twice as much as I could get to pay for it. In addition, most of the items I have here have risen in price far higher than in the past 2 or 3 years than most of the things other people are eating. Rice has gone up 100%, dried beans 250% over the past 2 or 3 years.
Now, while the camera lingers, we now want you to take a bite of that dog food.
I promised you I will.
All right.
The camera better not linger afterwards.
All right, all right.
You did it.
John, I just wanted to say
Okay.
that we don't issue food stamps on the basis of the size of the recipient.
That's a major product.
The Alpo is tasted. It's not that bad. It's not USDA inspected, but it's all right.
All right, we'll get back to that, of course.
Being
In the course of the
USDA
evening.
inspected these days doesn't guarantee anything.
Oh, yes, it does.
We hope, you know, well, I won't say, I started to say maybe there'll be an empty can at the end of the evening. We will see, John. All right, Mr. Tatum, tell us about your meal, sir.
Well, my meal, as you can see, is a very high protein diet. It has built-in cholesterol, of course, in the shrimp and the animal fat in the meat and the diet drink and so forth. Not cholesterol, but all basically protein. And the reason I chose this is because I knew that everybody would go to excesses in the other end. But this sort of meal is an acceptable one to the American public, is promoted, and frankly, it has as many problems as some of the other things that are promoted at this table. And I just want to emphasize that the lack of real nutritional knowledge is a dearth in our society today, Jim.
That's one of the main things we want to discuss here in a few minutes, is this whole business of nutritional knowledge. Mr. Yider of the Department of Agriculture, tell us about your food, sir.
Well, each individual item has a story, and we don't have time to cover them all on the first time around. But I did want to say, to start out, that it's easy to point out what's wrong with foods, but to be fair, we ought to point out what's right about foods too. It's easy to say what their shortcomings are nutritionally, but most foods also have some good things about them too. And we ought to be willing to tell both sides of the story too, rather than just one side of the story. That's the educational process. When you tell only one side of the story, that's just pure lobbying in the worst sense of the term. An educational process tells the whole story. And we don't have to eat foods that are very lacking in nutrition. There are a lot of good ones like milk. I believe that most
What
everybody
about the steak you're eating?
Sure, I think there's a story on the steak too, as a matter of fact. It's been chastised by people who say we ought to stop producing choice steaks like this one because it takes grain, and that if we didn't use that grain for cattle, we could ship it overseas to feed a lot of hungry people. That's really too simplistic. And one of the things we've got to be careful about when we talk about topics is as important to people as food is to not be simplistic and lose our sense of perspective. Because the fact of the matter is, if we stopped feeding all cattle in the United States grain, it would have essentially no impact on feeding hungry people around the world for a whole lot of reasons. Maybe that's enough for a starter.
Yeah.
You gonna let me answer that?
Sure, go right ahead.
I just want to point
Providing
out
I can rebut.
that they're calling that steak a choice steak, only except for us, we went and got with some other people, they got an injunction. It could have been a good steak that the USDA has decided to relabel as a choice steak.
Well, I don't understand that. Both of you are going to have to explain that.
Well, this is a little controversy over meat grading, and there's a proposal about to go into effect which would take the meat from younger animals and under certain conditions and move it into the choice grade. The idea being that meat from younger animals doesn't have to have as much marbling as meat for older animals, and so there's a change in grading. But
I got a hunch a lot of
these
the
feel that that's a ripoff.
Well, only because we're going to have to pay the choice price for it instead of the good price.
Before we
better for you too, So
what the I've got a let me ask a dumb question.
Price.
Let me ask a dumb question before you go on, because I've got a hunch that terms like this are going to come up. Would somebody explain very simply what marbling is? Dr. Hegstead, what's marbling?
Well, that's the fat. This thing is marbled. You see the steak with the fat in there, and that's
So it's just a fancy word for fat, right?
that's fat.
That's what makes it
Okay.
juicy. That's what makes it juicy.
That's true.
Yeah.
But it's bad for you, is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that we should cut down on the amount of fat we eat, and we have to be reasonable about this. We're not going to quit eating meat, and I don't want anybody to quote me as saying I didn't think we should eat shrimp or meat or drink milk or eat butter. But we should be more responsible both to ourselves and society by cutting down. Look at that meal. There's too much to eat there. It's wasteful to produce. And moderation is the thing we ought to sell, not elimination, but moderation in everything.
In fact, Paul, with all due respect, saying it's bad for you is the kind of simplistic comments that I was talking about earlier. That's what we ought not to do.
I'm interested to hear you say that, Clayton, because all the information I've seen from Department of Agriculture is simplistic. There's never any discussion of some of the diseases related to excesses in the American diet. Department of Agriculture does not talk about heart disease when it defends meat. It doesn't talk about tooth decay. And USDA nutritionists are fond of saying all food is good food, without getting into the details of that we Americans are consuming far too much of sugar and fat.
Well, when you say that we don't talk about heart disease with respect to a product like meat, it seems to me that you have to be able to make a cause and effect relationship that consuming meat causes heart disease. I don't happen to think that there's much evidence that indicates that to be the case. Now, Dr. Hegstead made that point as we started here earlier, but I'm no physician, so I can't draw any final conclusions here, but wouldn't it be fair to say that heart disease is related to a whole lot of things other than nutrition, including exercise, for example?
Well, it's a very complex disease, but these complex diseases will never be identified in that simplistic sense that meat causes heart disease. But it is associated with this kind of a diet.
We're going to go into detail specifically on this subject of nutrition, but I'd like to come back to Senator Schweiker for just a minute. Your thing was sugar. Do you see diet and nutrition and that sort of thing as the major problem in terms of food in America today, or would you put a bigger umbrella over it?
Yes, I see it as part of the problem, because I think in our nutritional aspects we tend to overlook the basic health aspects, and we go for the glamour or the good ad or the attractive packaging, or what your 6-year-old daughter has heard on television. Because as any mother knows, as she goes to the supermarket, her daughter picks the things off the shelf that she's seen advertised. And if they're sugar candy-coated creamy smacks, that's usually what she picks and puts in the cart, and you either have to leave your daughter at home or you have a fight in the supermarket. And that's a little bit of the problem.
Well, what's the answer, though? I mean, you saying don't have those things in the supermarket? I mean, in the general sense, things that are bad for you should not be sold?
Well, I think we have to educate our own people about the good and the bad, about the content, about labeling. I'd like to see a percentage sugar on labels. I'd like to see that if we're going to buy candy and call it cereal, maybe we ought to tell the people that it's candy in a cereal box. And I think if mothers knew that they were buying a cereal that was 50% sugar, I doubt they'd buy it. But I think this is what they don't know, and it's the nutritional illiteracy of this country that's really the problem.
How do you feel
about
this?
Senator Schweiker, of cereals and things that obviously have sugar in them, but it's the fact that the processing firms in the country are putting sugar in everything that we eat, peanut butter and onion soups and just about everything you've got. 2/3 of the sugar that's used in the country is put in by the processing firms, not by taking it out of the sugar bowl and spreading it on the grapefruit.
I showed both here in my meal, both the self-application, but the processed vegetables and foods all have it. And unfortunately, if you look at the studies of sugar, that's really where the bulk of it's going. So the person really has no choice and no knowledge.
No knowledge.
We even have
ignorance is bliss.
have a professor of flavor chemistry up at Rutgers University, which is a land-grant college tax-paid, that is trying to put sugar into the peas and into the fresh vegetables.
Flavor chemistry,
that's an interesting concept.
Mr. Tatum, sugar is a word that's being thrown around here tonight like it's a dirty word. Obviously, you don't agree with that.
Well, I don't, for many reasons. One, I think there's an awful lot of misinformation going around about sugar. When we talk about increases in consumption of sugar, and we go back and relate to before we had statistics that it was 20 pounds, nobody knows what it was at that point. But for over 50 years, the consumption of sugar in the United States per capita has been around 100 pounds, a little bit less, a little bit more, but still stays at that area.
Consumption has tripled in the last 100 years. I think we should go back before 50 years.
We're talking about 2.5 generations, Mike, and that's quite a time for any research in any way, shape, or form. Now, if I may, that the ideal, or let us say the realistic appraisal of the consumption of sugar must be based within, statistically, our lifetime. And 50 years is quite a time. Maybe it's 60 years. If you will go back even farther, you will see that still the consumption of sugar remains around, in the United States, about 100 pounds. The history of the world in this aspect is that emerging nations who have not had sugar before increase their consumption as time goes on, or they become more affluent, whatever that means, and then they reach some sort of table of around 100 or 90, whatever it is, pounds. In a recent experiment or research project, quite a well-known doctor who experimented in this area felt that the ideal, or the limits, or let us say the acceptable intake of sugar is roughly 2 grams per kilo of body weight. That means you certainly may, Doctor.
You say sugar consumption hadn't increased, but total food consumption has gone down in the United States.
It's not even the point that it's increased, and we were eating too much 50 years ago.
That is sugar has increased. Now, I'd like to be somewhere in between you. I think
you are.
I think that people should limit their intake of sugar, but primarily it's a diluent. And as we...
It's a very good word, Doctor.
We eat...
No, we just knew what it meant.
It's calories that don't carry anything else with it. And as our calorie consumption goes down, our fat consumption stays at about 40% of the calories, the sugar consumption at about 20. That means you really have to get your nutrients out of the other 40. And if you don't have very much food, like a lot of us do now, we can't eat very much because we're not very active. You have a hard time developing a good diet.
While we go on and eat our dinner now, and we want to now zero in on this subject of nutrition and health specifically. Many of you have already mentioned it, and that's what we've been talking about this most recently, of course, because sugar relates to that. And to launch the dialogue, I want to show you a little film that NPAC reporter Christopher Gall did in Savannah, Georgia. It's about 2 people.
Would you move those potato chips so we can see it? Not potato chips, so reconstituted potatoes. Potato chips.
The day that I had my heart attack, I was walking down the street, and it just seemed like a rubber band snapped. My arm started going numb, the left side of my body, my leg. Severe pain in the left side. It just felt like your chest was going to bust. And then it eased off a little, but then it got worse. And by that time, I was just about on the blink of passing out.
When she first came into the clinic, Amanda was not able to behave or function like a normal 5-month-old baby. She functioned more like a baby that was 2.5 to 3 months old at that time. There were some reason at that point to have called her a retarded child.
Amanda Williams, a 2-year-old child of poor parents, and Jim Walters, a 40-year-old Savannah business manager, shared a problem that could have killed them: malnutrition. For Jim Walters, it was too much of the wrong kind of food. For Amanda Williams, it was too little of the right kind of food. Man and child, they represent the dramatic but not untypical consequences of a dangerous diet.
John Murray, red line, John Murray, red line, please.
Americans spend some $125 billion a year on food, a staggering amount that makes us the most fed, but probably the worst fed people in the developed countries of the world. As we stuff ourselves with grain-fed, well-marbled beef, sugar-coated cereals, potato chips, and butter-filled baked goods, we pay some $30 billion a year in medical bills to fight the diseases our way of eating helped give us.
Well, mostly we eat fried food and baked potatoes, and we eat out quite a bit at Bonanza and places like that. And, well, that's just the way I was brought up. Had a lot of gravies and everything fat and cake, pie.
We have become a fat people. About 1/3 of the adults in the United States are more than 20% overweight. The result? A dramatic increase in what are sometimes called the diseases of civilization: obesity, tooth decay, diabetes, hypertension, some forms of cancer, and heart disease. 1 million Americans will die this year from cardiovascular or blood vessel diseases, a fact which led to community development of a risk factor center in Savannah that tries to fight the killer and help people like Jim Walters. There are many lifestyle ingredients in cardiovascular diseases, but to Dr. James Metz, head of the center, one in particular stands out.
Nutrition is a major contributory factor to many heart attacks and strokes. And this is not just nutrition at the time that they have the attack, but the lifelong patterns of eating.
Definitely my heart attack changed my ways of eating. I think a person, when he gets to a certain age, and I'm 40 now, I think you've got to look at the future a little and just decide where you want to live to be 70 or live to be 50. So I'm trying for 70.
What almost killed Jim Walters was high blood cholesterol, the central risk factor in heart disease. And so trained dietitians at the clinic work with Walters and others like him to make sure that from now on the food they eat and the way they fix it won't kill them.
An easy way to do your ground beef would be to have your butcher give you out exactly a pound, divided in 4 pieces. And by the time you cook that piece, and you remember how we cook our meat, we bake it, broil it, boil it. If you remember the ways to cook things, this is very important.
Jim Walters' wife, Kathleen, now pays more careful attention to what kind of food she cooks.
I serve a steak, a salad, and 1 vegetable, either a green vegetable or a yellow vegetable, squash, Brussels sprouts, or something like that. And that's about the extent of it, 1 meal. I just cook what's on this diet, and we all eat the same thing. We have chicken, fish, ground beef,
well, that's about
no pork.
That's about the extent of that part. Now, like me, I get up, I eat a bowl of oatmeal for breakfast. I'll eat maybe 2 vegetables and a salad for lunch, and a meat, a vegetable, and salad for dinner at night. And I feel good.
We feel that many of the premature aging processes that we see in people 45 years of age, for example, actually begin in adolescence, if not in infancy, and are based in poor nutrition. We are surveying school children now and checking their blood pressures, and in interviewing them we ask them what they have for breakfast. And one of the answers we get is Coca-Cola and moon pie, and this does not seem like a well-balanced breakfast for a school child.
Look for the best, yeah, live life refreshed. Look for the real thing. Coca-Cola.
No country's got more good things than we've got, including the world's best drink to help us enjoy them all. So have a Coke and start.
Children are encouraged by our adult society to eat and drink sugar-filled goodies that are clearly bad for their health when taken habitually.
Sugar Bear, look! I got Sugar Bear Super Sugar Crisp and he can't have it.
Is it yummy?
Right.
Yummy for your tummy?
Right.
From infancy, and when they're old enough to be affected by slick television advertising, children are taught to be sugar junkies.
Magic markers in red, yellow, blue, and green.
And Tasty Cake is still Tasty Cake.
Poor families who are hard-pressed to buy regular groceries feel as much, if not more, pressure to buy their children pastry rather than fruit. Tasty Cake seems more enticing and accessible than whole wheat bread.
Tasty Cake is still
All the good things wrapped up in one.
This is 2-year-old Amanda and her 20-year-old mother, Frances Williams. Because they are poor, malnutrition can strike them harder and sooner than it can the more affluent. From the day she was born, Amanda simply didn't get enough food. Her medical records revealed she existed on well below the number of calories she needed to grow and develop normally. By the time Amanda was 5 months old, her family had begun to fear the child was mentally retarded, and so Amanda's mother sought help from a local mental health clinic. Public health nurse Nora Younger explains why.
She was not able to hold her head up at 5 months. She was not rolling over well, and there was delays, particularly in motor development, because we thought that nutrition was playing a big part in her functioning or her ability to do things like other babies, that we should reserve that diagnosis or use of the word retarded and wait and follow Amanda and see how she progressed on a diet that was adequate to meet her nutritional needs. She may have been able to survive. It would be kind of difficult to say this. Sometimes they do die from the lack of proper food. This is terrific to see this much improvement.
Before she recovered, Amanda Williams had been a victim of malnutrition for 2 reasons. Her family could ill afford to consistently buy enough food, while Amanda's mother really didn't know anything about nutrition. What saved Amanda from, at best, a life of being mentally retarded was her referral to a little-known federally sponsored program, Women, Infants and Children, known as WIC, a program designed to ensure a proper diet through a combination of financial assistance and regular nutrition counseling. Now, Mrs. Williams, Amanda, and her 6-month-old baby brother Larry visit the WIC clinic once a month so that their dietary progress can be examined and maintained properly.
How are you today? Fine. And how's Sadie doing?
Well, he's doing okay.
Now, does she have milk in the morning or juice with her breakfast?
Juice.
If they don't get the right foods before they're a year old, they don't make enough brain cells to be normal. And there's no way you can reverse this process. How much milk does she drink a day?
Patricia Buttimer, the WIC nurse, knows only too well that she must keep pressure on Mrs. Williams and mothers like her to make sure their children's daily diet is sufficiently nutritious.
What did Amanda eat for breakfast this morning?
Grits and eggs and juice.
And what did she have for lunch? They should start their day with cereal or an egg, milk. If they don't have milk at lunch, they should have 2 slices of cheese. Eggs should be given to them 3 to 5 times a week. They have to have citrus fruit juices. Of course, they need meats, vegetables, and fresh fruits. And how about collard greens or cabbage?
Yes, ma'am.
She does eat those. Does she get fruit very often? In the WIC clinics, we can't keep track of what they eat at home. We can ask and try to re-emphasize foods that the children need and how many times a day they need it. And eventually we see a result, and it really is very satisfying.
Amanda Williams now has a good chance of becoming a normal, healthy child because her mother got good nutritional education and some financial help to provide Amanda with the right kind of food. But the WIC program that helped her is small and in danger of being eliminated. Jim Walters got help too, in his case from a group of concerned Savannah citizens willing to fight an uphill battle. But there are tens of thousands of Jim Walters and children like Amanda who may die because there is no coherent national food policy that would ensure all Americans of a sound nutritional education. How much human damage must be inflicted before something is done?
Well, reporter Christopher Gall asks a good question in his report from Savannah, Georgia. Incidentally, we went to Savannah because we felt that was a typical American city, no better or worse than any other city. But his question raises other questions, I think, and that is, why is it that as we get richer and richer in this country, do we seem to get poorer and poorer in our diets, at least in some ways? And why is it, since we've become nutritionally smarter in this country, we still seem to act in a nutritionally dumb way? Stu, I think I'd like to throw the first question out to you, and that is, why don't we have some national food policy to try to help the people to eat better and to consume better foods? The Agriculture Department, and as some critics have long seen it, seems to be more concerned about producer protection than consumer protection.
Well, I don't happen to agree with that. In fact, I don't happen to agree with your basic premise. So maybe we ought to just go back to that. Your suggestion was that as we become more affluent in this country, we eat worse than we did before, or words to that effect. I don't happen to think that's true. I think probably the very great bulk of Americans are eating better than they did some years back. Now, this isn't to say that everybody agrees with what they consume, but they certainly have the prerogative of consuming nutritionally adequate diets. And we've got a free kind of society in which we still permit people to make their own judgments as to what they buy in a supermarket. And I hope that nobody around this table is suggesting that we change that and mandate what people eat so that they assuredly obtain a nutritionally adequate diet. I still think people ought to have a free choice. Now, as to your basic point of why isn't the Department of Agriculture educating the people of the country about better nutrition, it seems to me that all of us have an obligation to do that, not just the Department of Agriculture. I think the department does have a major role there. We have an awful lot of people working in the Extension Service throughout the United States, much more primarily in rural areas, of course, because that's where the Department of Agriculture functions. But many well-trained people, including nutritionists and home economists, who I think are performing a very major and positive role in this respect. Now, sure, other agencies of government could do more. People in the private sector could do more. People in the consumer advocate groups who are represented around this table could do more. We in agriculture could do more. I don't think anybody would assert that we're all perfect, but let's not assert that nothing is being done in the way of nutrition education.
I'd like to support that argument. The major diseases now are heart disease and diseases of affluence, and we only have to go back to the 1930s when we had serious malnutrition in the United States. Now, I think the film, the cases of serious infant malnutrition in the United States are relatively rare. You have to search for them. The case of heart disease is what half of us are going to die of. Now, I don't know how you equate those in terms of national significance,
but in terms of diet, does this increase in heart disease really reflect an increasingly bad diet in America, as a number of nutrition experts seem to contend?
Well, as we've already noted, this is a complex disease. It presumably has to do with exercise and diet and probably things we still don't understand. But you do have to make decisions without adequate knowledge, and the best advice now is to develop a prudent diet, which means reduce your cholesterol and saturated fat intake primarily, keep your weight down, and then exercise. Now, that's a bad diet, but it's better to have that kind of a diet than the diet that most people had 50 years ago.
I'd like to get back to a couple of things that Clayton was saying. USDA doesn't do very much in the way of nutrition education, even with its many extension agents. Coca-Cola spends...
That's a subjective comment now, Mike.
Well, I'll give you some objective facts. Coca-Cola or General Foods spends more on advertising than USDA does on nutrition education. And that's,
But do you equate everything in dollar terms, Mike?
Well, it's some indication.
That's not a quantitative measure of nutrition education.
No, but it's some indication. The food industry spends $4 billion a year on food advertising. Not all for junk foods, some for nourishing foods, but largely, a lot of it for fabricated junk foods, high in fat, high in sugar. I think we've got a situation where one of the underlying problems is that a lot of these foods, Cool Whip Swiggle, are made simply to satisfy corporate stockholders. The corporations have a need to constantly expand to satisfy stockholders. Ultimately, that results in junk foods because companies have to produce new products. So we've seen the debasement of breakfast cereals, a classic example, where breakfast cereals used to be quite wholesome, whole grain foods. Some of them are still around, but they've been diluted out by dozens of high sugar, artificially colored and flavored. There was even a cream-filled breakfast cereal.
But isn't it also true that the careful shopper can still find the nutritional foods.
Absolutely. But what goes against that is that all the encouragement is to eat junk foods, starting with infancy. There are high-sugar baby foods where sugar is the major ingredient. And then the advertising aimed at children for the magic puffs and the breakfast squares.
Is it worse now than it used to be, Dr. Hegstead, or as a result of television advertising?
What do you mean by
just in
worse?
terms of the basic American diet on average? Are we eating worse than we used to? Removing the depression and the malnutrition aspect. I'm talking about the average American.
You can't remove that because that's a fact of life. But
all right, then let me phrase
the
it.
affluent people, I assume, are eating very similar to what.
All right, that's my question.
50 years ago.
No, there is an answer.
But they were working much harder, and that makes a difference.
There is some data. In 1965, the Department of Agriculture did a survey. We were eating worse, the people who were surveyed. In 75, they were supposed to do one. But because this is a political subject, the Bureau of the Budget will move the money until at least fiscal year 1977, and we may never have a 10-year review. I think they're afraid of what they might find.
Oh, I disagree with that. That isn't why.
I don't
Well, give us a reason.
that's a subjective conclusion that
Well, give us your
based on no facts at all. Well, you're going to have to ask the Bureau of the Budget, not us. But I don't think you can just automatically sit here and condemn the Bureau of the Budget for an alleged political decision without any facts whatsoever to support that conclusion.
Other than for every 10 years they had been doing that.
Well,
this is the first time.
Trouble with the USDA survey was that we never got the results, and for 5 or 6 years it went into the historical record. We don't need that kind of a survey. We need something that tells us what's happening tomorrow.
But nonetheless, Dr. Hegstead, I was reading something the other day. I was doing some research on you, and one of the things you said was that we could remove 35% of the foods from grocery shelves and they'd never be missed.
I think that's right.
Except in the boardrooms.
Carol Foreman,
But I think you have to remember that I'm told that 30 or 40 years ago, the grocery store had 400 items in it, perhaps. Now it has 10,000 items.
But you're saying many of those things really have no nutritional value, isn't that what you're saying?
I didn't say they had no nutritional value. I said they could be removed and we'd never miss them. I don't understand why we have to have 60 or 75 breakfast cereals on a shelf.
There's something very, as an outsider, non-expert, there's something very inconsistent about what you all are saying, that here we've gone through a period, Carol Foreman, where there has been more information, more concern expressed, more national interest in nutrition than there's ever been before, ever, in the last 5 to 10 years. Now, why is this information not getting out, and why is it not being borne out in what people buy and eat?
Well, let me back up a minute and say perhaps we're not eating much worse than we were a number of years ago, but I always hope there will be progress and that we'll be eating better this year than we were a number of years ago. And that doesn't seem to be, or as best we can, and we don't seem to be carrying that out. I think if Mike and I added up our budgets and threw in the budget for the House Agriculture Committee to boot, we wouldn't come up with the $4 million that General Foods spends each year to advertise its products on television. Now, we all know that most Americans
But isn't that a cop-out, really?
No, most Americans get most of their information from television.
Yeah, but from television advertising? You're saying that people get all their information from
You ever sat and watched
advertising?
a room full of kids who never watch the program, but the minute the ad comes on, they all turn around and look? Let me talk about shake and bake. Some other people came into the market and started taking away the crispy chicken coating business away from them, so they quickly came out with something called Better and Bake and quickly snatched the market back from them. Product differentiation of the kind that comes through on television advertising makes money for people.
Mm-hmm.
You get a lot more money than you make by selling breadcrumbs and some seasonings.
But why are people so dumb?
I don't think they're dumb, Jim. We have a situation where people who are criticizing the food supply, who are complaining about high sugar foods, high fat foods, are threatening some very big economic interests. The food and beverage industry is a $154 billion industry. They do not allow anti-sugar advertisements on television. Consumer groups cannot afford to put anti-sugar advertisements facing Mr. Tatum's pro-sugar advertisements in Reader's Digest. We don't have the access to the media. We don't have the money. Department of Agriculture does essentially nothing in the way of nutrition education.
Mike, that's not right.
Mike,
let's show some semblance of
no,
fairness
but talk
in
to
your
us about there are counter ads on television about tobacco. Talk to us about what kind of ads on
people are still
television
smoking.
USDA buys to talk about what are the possible hazards. What affirmative action program is there?
Well, what you're saying, Carol, is that there's a lot of advertising that's creating a consumer demand for some of these products that you would prefer that people not eat, or that you believe that they ought not eat if they're going to have a satisfactory level of nutrition. So the question becomes, so what? What's your recommendation to do about it?
For a starter, we might have some counter advertising. We might use some attract the children and the adults in the same nature that they've been attracted in the other direction. I think Sesame Street has been a great success on television using precisely that method of operation.
Senator Schweiker, I see you're dying to get in a word. Why don't you get in a word?
Well, I've enjoyed my chocolate cake a la mode so much.
With all that sugar in it, too.
I want to say if I fall asleep halfway through the panel discussion, you'll know why, because if you eat a high-sugar meal and have any kind of a blood chemistry situation, you're liable to go to sleep, so please don't drive after you eat a high-sugar meal. But aside from that, the other point I'd like to make is I'm eating here, ignorance is bliss, and we are a nation of nutritional illiterates. We provide no mechanism of education for our people. The only course I can recall in school was a health course where I learned a little bit about nutrition as a phys ed health course, and that was it for the whole school year of every child. And maybe we're changing. I have a bill in to put in our medical schools, and the younger doctors admit they don't know enough and would like to know more. The older doctors don't acknowledge that there's a gap here at all in nutrition education. Have a bill in for nutritional labeling, and belatedly the FDA is moving here, and a bill in for nutritional education in our elementary and secondary schools. But if you don't educate the people, they can't possibly know what they're doing wrong, and I think that really is the basic issue. Our culture is a machine-oriented culture. We take our automobiles every 6,000 miles and turn them in, and we take better care of machines than we do our people. In essence, we practice preventive maintenance, but not preventive medicine. And since it affects every one of our health bodies, it just escapes me as to why everybody doesn't put in as national policy of preventive medicine, of nutritional education, and yet it's lacking everywhere. You give a talk on this subject, get 200 people there. But talk on any other subject, I can get 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000.
Well, where's the fall down? Is the fall down with the government? Is the fall down with the people who won't respond to your suggestions?
I think it's a fall down of the whole system. The whole culture is wrong. We're really not a health-oriented, nutrition-oriented culture. The TV ads do get my 6-year-old daughter to go in and pull it off the shelf, and a fight ensues with my wife about whether to do it, because nutritional education isn't on the label, because we don't have a proper perspective of it, and because that isn't a selling factor, and it should be. The society's at fault. We're all at fault.
Senator, Action for Children's Television is an organization that has fought long and hard to get rid of ads aimed at children on television. Federal Trade Commission and Federal Communications Commission have rejected the idea, despite 100,000 letters that parents sent in. Is there any chance of Congress taking action to outlaw advertising aimed at young children?
Well, I think there's a chance, but I'd have to say I think it's a remote chance. For just the same reason that we can regulate what our machines do, but we just can't bring ourselves to regulate in any manner what our healthy body should or shouldn't do. And I don't quite know why it's that way, but it is. And where does it begin? I guess it begins with all of us, and yet we haven't done the job. I think our society has failed in this respect.
There's something else.
May I?
Yes,
Senator, just in passing, you were saying that sugar, you might fall asleep. One of the attributes of sugar is to keep you awake. In fact, in some countries, they had a public campaign that drivers late at night, if they got tired, they would take sugar. But that is my main point. That was an aside. I think we are discussing around here, which I certainly agree with, that there is a lack of nutritional understanding education in the United States. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Perhaps, not perhaps, it is worldwide, but we're talking about this country. However, what I do object to, and I'm not talking about sugar particularly at this point, what I do object to is that pseudo-scientists are passing around their words without any particular background in what they're talking about. There is an awful lot of scientific knowledge that could refute a lot of things that have been said here at this table, which I don't think is the place to bring it up, particularly in the sugar area. But we are a nation which seems to try and find instant answers to very complicated questions. Dr. Hegstead, at a recent National Academy of Science, you, I think, made a remark that we are trying to pick these things out of context without an idea of the total nutritional value. Each one of the foods that we have some value. Now, perhaps in certain areas they are used in excess. Nobody in their right mind would advocate excesses in anything, be it alcohol, be it politics, Senator. It's something that we have to learn to have moderation and balance in our nutrition.
Mr. Tatum, film also has its value, and let's go back now for a few minutes to Christopher Gall in Savannah, Georgia, and he has this film about the life and times in an American supermarket. And I'm sure you'll be particularly interested in this, Mr. Tatum.
I hope it doesn't correct what
I don't know.
Just returned from a trip to the supermarket. By no means a joyful experience. An average American family, the Exleys, like their counterparts across the country, are feeling the economic pinch these days. A pinch that hurts the most when they buy food. On this supermarket trip, the Exleys bought enough groceries for 3 days. 2 years ago, their grocery bill would have been a little more than $20. The basic necessities they bought this day cost them $34.
With prices as high as they are now, it's just taking everything you can make to make ends meet. And I don't think the supermarket really gives the consumer the fair shake. They take theirs off the top, and then we usually get what's left.
Candy Exley does most of her shopping at a local supermarket, part of a small Savannah chain of markets. Although she tries to be a careful, thoughtful shopper, Mrs. Exley finds it more and more difficult to make rational shopping decisions. She feels that the forces at work in the food industry, which for her are reflected in the supermarket, are somehow conspiring to confuse and deceive her.
It's kind of getting to be a hassle to buy groceries and go in the supermarket. Prices have gone up so high, and the quality of the food I don't think is as good as it was a few years ago. I think they're cutting corners, and you're not getting the quality for what you're paying for. If you buy canned goods, I think if you really checked them closely, you would find that what used to be 10 ounces, it's like 9.5 ounces, which is half an ounce, but it's still, you're not really getting the volume. They put things out in front of the store, and you think it's on sale, and if you don't stop and check it, you can buy something and pay twice for it. I feel pretty stupid when I pick up something like that's supposedly on sale and it's not really on sale, because I didn't take the time to check out prices between what was on the shelf and what they put on the end of the aisle.
If Mrs. Exley feels stupid, then so do a lot of other shoppers, for they've been led to believe that big displays in front of the aisles are reserved for low-price specials. For the supermarket, this ethically dubious technique often means sales will run some 600% above normal. Then there's the old eye-level trick. As the housewife moves through the aisles, her eyes travel quite naturally along a row of shelves ranging from about eye level to just below her waist. And that's where any smart store manager places most of his profitable items. Toby Belford, a veteran food salesman, represents one of the forces Mrs. Exley must contend with, because his job is to make sure he gets the shelf positions that will influence the housewife's buying decisions as she hurries down the aisles.
The first thing that we're concerned with, of course, we want as much of our product on the shelf as we can get, so it'll get the attention of the consumer. And secondly, in a desirable way, we like to have a product that's at eye level. Or if we have a product that appeals to children, then oftentimes we are more interested in the lower shelf, where we can kind of spread it out and it'll catch the attention of the children. The high percentage of grocery sales are spontaneous sales or impulse buying. Once they get you in the store, the housewife will buy, say, 25% of her grocery bill will be stuff that she did not intend to buy when she came to the store. So that's why you have the special merchandising gimmicks of one kind or another to get her in there so she'll buy the other stuff.
The supermarket owner defends the merchandising techniques.
We put items at eye level that the consumer uses more often and have a decent profit so that they will be able to find them more easily. But any of these ideas of displaying items so that people will pick them up or putting things at eye level are all part of a merchandising scheme that I think has been part of America, whether it's supermarket business or any kind of business.
The supermarket, glossy symbol of our affluence, is in many ways the end product of American sales ingenuity, and the unaware shopper walks these aisles at some peril, surrounded by the traps of clever merchandising gimmicks. And yet there's another and perhaps even more potent force she has been subjected to, the food industry's advertising power.
In the grocery trade, and as is in everything, there's a lot of misleading advertisement. For example, when you read see a TV commercial that says, buy this item and you save 30 cents, and yet you can check other ads and that's their regular price. So what they're saying in effect is save 30 cents from what we would normally charge you. I mean, you could study the ads week after week and this is the case.
Well, advertising does, especially advertising on television, does influence us some. The children, when we go to the supermarket, they like certain brands of cereal, and if they see things advertised on television, they want to try that particular cereal that was advertised on television, or maybe the cereal has a free gift inside if you buy that particular box.
Fruity Pebbles and Fruit Loops.
They have a definite influence.
As Krispies, they say Snap Crackle Pop.
The food industry is the biggest and most powerful industry in the country. Small wonder, then, that the harried housewife is no match for this giant when she confronts its smaller but most visible part, the supermarket. Merchandising gimmicks like aisle displays that only look like sales and shelf positioning that hides the more economical items don't add too much to the cost of food when taken individually. But taken all together, they make a real difference at the checkout line. Thus, the housewife's frustration with the supermarket raises this question: should the food industry assume a greater sense of morality in dealing with the consumer? Since, after all, we must buy food to live.
The Last American Supper will continue in 15 seconds. This is PBS, the Public Broadcasting Service. We continue the Last American Supper.
Well, as we saw in that last film report from Savannah, I'd like to remind all of you that the question, it seems to me, does go beyond the industry itself and to matters of public policy. Why, for example, when people are eating more today, population has expanded, so that's obvious, and the industry is expanded, is there less competition than more competition? And why should store prices of many products keep going up at a time when farm prices, in many areas at least, have leveled off? Mr. Tatum?
I don't think that that statement is true, Paul. I would say that the majority of food increase in price outside of the recent rise in sugar is probably labor and other expenses, taxes, etc., cost of running businesses. The recent rise in sugar was a thing created by a supply and demand situation which determined the basic price of sugar, which is raw, and from there the processing was taken off. It's a commodity market is a very tenuous thing. It's something that you're living in a world of guessing every day, and if you're in the financial or in the commercial end of this sort of thing, you believe me, a lot of money is riding on decisions of today, tomorrow, and yesterday.
No, but food
I
prices.
love it. Every time we get in this conversation about why food prices are high, I hear it's because labor.
Right.
And if it's not labor, then it's the farmer. And the customer has a choice. We can hate farmers
It's a
or labor.
combination.
Labor got about an 8% increase in the food industry last year. Farmers didn't get any increase at all, and I think there was a sugar company that got something over a 300% profit increase.
One that got 1,200% profit increase, and there's 4 sugar refiners that monopolize 70% of the sugar refinery market in this
But it's
country.
not just sugar.
No, it's not just sugar.
Well, let's talk about
It's a
sugar.
variety of things which have
But
gone
let us
up
talk
in
about
price.
sugar a moment, because he suggested supply and demand. But last year, in 1974, when sugar prices went out of sight, supply exceeded demand for the first time in 3 years. And then the sugar companies came forward and said, well, it's the Arabs. The Arabs have come over here and bought up all of our sugar in our commodities markets. And in fact, the Arabs bought less sugar last year than they did in previous years. Then they said, Mr. Taylor, let me finish, then they said that it was the farmer, that the farmer was responsible for this. And in fact, the farm price of sugar went up only 30% last year. But the middleman price of sugar went up 300%. And that produced the 250% profit increase of Amstar, and it produced the 1,200% profit increase of Great Western Sugar.
And after those hearings that the Council on Wage and Price Stability had, and when customers started boycotting sugar, this worldwide shortage that caused the prices to go up must have disappeared because suddenly the prices started to come down.
It's still there, Carol, but I don't think that this is a place to discuss the pricing end. First of all, I am not an expert in this area. However, there are, I might add to you, Mr. Hightower, and I think you should know it, that there are a lot of things when you deal on a futures market that have nothing to do with a company's position. You have to buy and sell. But as I say, I'm willing to discuss this with you at any other time.
Let me move back to the general subject of the distribution of food and the whole system, John Kramer, from the farmer all the way through the middleman down to the supermarket. The supermarket is the end result of this system. You've made a study of this in terms of who's getting what. Where are the huge profits in this whole process, or are there any?
Thank God I'm a country boy born on East 86th Street in New York. I'm for the farmer. The farmer in his great heyday a couple of years ago got about 46% of the food dollar. He's now down to 39% and going further down. And farming is a risky business. In a lot of crops now, people are, including beef, people are marketing the product at below the cost it takes them to raise it. On the other end, you've got Safeway and a lot of other supermarkets. Safeway in the fall of 1974 had a 20% or close to a 20% return on its equity. In the regulated utilities business, we let them get about 9%. Airlines are lucky if they get 5 or 6%. Major industries are lucky if they get 10 or 12%.
Farmers get 4%.
Well, yeah, and sometimes they go into negative net income.
So do consumers.
Consumers are also always in negative net income. Somewhere in between and at the end, not at the farmer's end, a lot of money is being siphoned off, and I think Jim Hightower has done some more work on that.
Well, but where? I mean, who's
so
siphoning it
What's
off?
so evil about profits, Mr. Kramer? Is do you really want to go to a free enterprise system here without
Promise
profits?
not to talk simplistically.
Right. Why don't we go to a free enterprise system? That's what I'd sure be for. That would be terrific. If we could have a little bit of that in the middle sector of the food economy, I think that'd be wonderful.
I think we do have a free
Well,
enterprise
we've got
economy.
the point out to that, and they say there's 32,000 of these food manufacturing corporations. And they always say we're just the epitome of competition. But in fact, 50 of those corporations make 75% 75% of the profits in the industry. And in the average food line, 4 firms will control at least 55% of the market. That's monopoly power.
Well,
we've got to begin to deal with that, sir, so that independent competitors and so that farmers can begin to benefit and pass on those cost savings to consumers. And that doesn't happen if you've got this sort of blockage in the middle.
What does monopoly power mean, Jim? What does it mean?
It means the ability to set prices without any relation to
Does it
farm
mean
prices.
higher prices?
It means much higher prices. It
Well,
means
now let me cite for you the example of vegetables, I am told. Vegetables have gone up tremendously, and yet there is tremendous competition in the vegetable industry. So that goes directly against what you're contending.
there's not tremendous competition in the vegetable industry because of the ability of the marketing corporations to control the farm. In fact, 75% of fresh vegetables, such as I'm eating here, right here, are controlled under vertically integrated contracts by corporations. And in processed vegetables, it's 95%. If you want to buy canned peas, you're going to have to deal with Del Monte Corporation, pretty much. If a farmer wants to sell peas for canning, he's got to deal with Del Monte Corporation because Del Monte Corporation is the one that controls that market.
Federal Trade Commission, 2 weeks ago, hit large vegetable marketing, so-called cooperative in California for price fixing.
Sure, but if those concerns of yours are legitimate, Jim, and I'm not suggesting they aren't legitimate, you know, there are ways of recourse in the system now. We've got a Federal Trade Commission, and we've got an antitrust division in the Justice Department.
What has the Department of Agriculture done to really support farmers against that and to really begin to fight that battle for them? They haven't been doing that.
Well, anybody can fight that battle. You can communicate with the Federal Trade Commission as well as anybody else can.
But the battle gets fought and lost. In 1920, the meat market was controlled by 5 meat packers, and the Justice Department went in and got a consent decree. And now the Justice Department is desperate to get those meat packers back into the meat industry because the meat industry is now controlled by the supermarkets. A&P just got socked with a $32 million antitrust judgment for controlling meat prices in the West, and the big supermarkets are the ones that control meat prices. The farmer can't bargain.
How do they control them? How do they control
with immense buying power. They buy all the beef. I think every week A&P puts down $20 million out of Chicago. 20 million pounds out of Chicago, and they use a thing called the yellow sheet, which is the price mechanism that sets the price. Everybody else looks at the yellow sheet and buys beef accordingly. So A&P's big buying power sets the prices that everybody in the country has to pay.
Is this a question of proof, John? As you know, as a lawyer, we can sit here and make allegations about these kinds of things, but it ultimately comes down to a matter of evidence and proof.
Yeah, well, that's the 32 million was all.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, but I mean, there in a case they did do it, John.
Yeah. But the trouble is, that's one case, and it's 50 years after the meat packer decree, and the meat business is probably worse off than it was in.
And who brought that case?
What are you?
It had to be the farmers that brought the case. The government did not get involved.
Right. Let me point out that at an Agriculture Department meeting last fall, gentlemen from the Federal Trade Commission complained rather violently about the fact that when they seek help, when they ask the USDA to use that enormous data that the department collects on all aspects of the food industry to indicate whether or not there's price fixing, he said that it gets turned down. I think you ought to have an affirmative.
Carol, I don't believe that.
Who was there? I was there.
The Department of Agriculture is just as interested as you are in avoiding anti-competitive situations in the marketing business.
I asked Mr. Paulberg if you would go through all of your data and reassess it, run it through the computer.
Mr. Paulberg?
Don Paulberg,
He's one of my colleagues as Director of Agricultural Economics.
I asked if you would undertake an affirmative action program to go through all the data that the department collects to see if to examine it specifically for the purpose of seeing if there are anti-competitive situations in any of the meat industry and the fruits and vegetables supply in this country. And the response to me from Dr. Paulberg was that you don't have the power to do that and you have no intention of seeking the power to do that. I think that it's a reasonable request to make.
Well, the Department of Agriculture is not the regulatory agency in this area, as you know. That's the Federal Trade Commission and the Justice Department.
But you have the data that would make their investigations worthwhile.
You bet, and we would be pleased to provide whatever data we have that would aid those kinds of investigations.
We could come out of this dinner session with an agreement.
We'd be glad to. Right, but it's more than just digging some data out of a computer. There has to be a little proof there.
Well, that's in your computers. It's there.
That's a subjective determination.
Let me throw out a simplistic type of process concept here, though. When we take the food from the very beginning, of the farmer back to the very end, the people we just saw who shop at a supermarket, whether in Savannah, Georgia, or anywhere else. Not only do we have the managements and the corporations in the middle, we also have Teamsters driving trucks, we have people working for each one of these companies all along the way, do we not? I mean there's a lot of things involved in this whole process. It's not that simple as saying, you know, that this happens and then there's huge corporate profits, is there not, Carol?
And that leads to the question of how do you really know who the villain is in all of this? It's so complicated.
When you look
and
at
who
the
says
fact,
there's a villain?
That's the point.
I do.
Not everybody agrees that there's a villain. We keep assuming that
nobody likes to see prices continue to go up at a time when some farm prices are being depressed. So people do make some assumption that somebody may be excessively profiteering.
Maybe, but not necessarily so.
Paul, in the farm area, you've got to, everybody's got to understand this is a cyclical business. And leave sugar out for the moment, which I would like to talk about a little later on. But there are times when the commodity of which the farmer produces is at a high level. Maybe there is a surplus and the price goes down. In the sugar area, particularly in the beet area, you have agreements between the farmer and the processor where he gets a percentage of the total selling price.
Some of the beet farmers disagreed with that last year because when the sugar prices went up, they didn't get theirs. Out there in Mr. Geyer's Nebraska,
No, you're oversimplifying it, and there was another question. Here again, I don't think this is the place I would like to discuss it with you any time.
Well, could I put the question more fundamentally then, and maybe Senator Schweiker would like to offer an opinion on this. Is it fair if a major supermarket chain, as you suggest, made a profit of 20% on its investment? Is that fair at a time when so many people are suffering in this country, when we know that there is widespread malnutrition and so many people are on food stamps? That's a legitimate question. How do you feel about that?
I think it boils down, Paul, into two aspects. If a particular chain may be that more efficient than another chain and really doing a better job, and if they're the exception because of good management, I think that's one perhaps mitigating circumstance. On the other hand, if they're taking advantage of a very adverse economic condition and not, say, lowering prices when prices do lower from the farmer to the middleman to the market, and consistently keep prices up or level when prices go down at their end, then I think that's something the Antitrust Division ought to be looking into. I had a member of my staff a few months back, within 30 minutes, had gone into one of the markets and had found 5 shelf items that had been triple stamped with pricing. 3 prices had gone on it, some as high as double the price that was originally put on it. And actually it all occurred what was on the shelf. Now, there was no question that the price they paid for the material was obviously much lower, yet they had the policy of marking it up. And this was about a month or two after some of the larger chains announced they would no longer do this. So to me, there is a very flagrant abuse of a very bad economic situation, and I think it is up to the Department of Justice to crack down. I think that is abuse, and that is where profit becomes a distortion. I have no objection to the profit motive. That's fine. But if it's put to ill use, and if it's used to squeeze the people at the lower end of the spectrum when they're profiting and not passing on savings that are passed through by the farmers, I think it's wrong. I think the government should do something, and then I think we're negligent if we don't.
You know, the impression you get from the film is that the buyer is so dumb they can't do anything about this. And is that true? You know, you've got cereals on the market that are 30, 35 cents a pound, and there's $100.40 a pound. Now, why is it possible to educate the consumer to shop wisely or not?
I think the senator said it before. You go into a supermarket with your kid, and the kid grabs the sugary breakfast cereal.
There are a lot of things the kid wants that the senator doesn't buy his kid.
Oh, come on.
There ought to be a little discipline from parents there.
That is correct.
Why should a parent be put in that situation
by
a corporation of having a fight with a child?
Don't you discipline your children, Mike?
Well, I fortunately don't have any, so I don't have to do it.
Well, that may be a blessing, too.
Mr. Yatter, what about the statement that was made by the grocer in that film where he said that this type of thing of eye level displays, the big display at the end of the counter, whatever. He said, and I think I'm quoting correctly here, that this is part of the American merchandise system, or words to that effect. Do you agree with that?
I think anybody merchandising a product, whether it be food or television sets or anything else, is going to want to do it as effectively as he can to maximize his sales. He's trying to maximize his profits. That's what the system is all about. Now, so I don't find any fault with a supermarket manager trying to increase his sales. That increases his family income too. The real question is whether the people who walk up and down those aisles are in some way misled by that process, or putting it another way, whether they're misled or not, whether something can be done to educate them in such a way that they'll make proper choices.
I think the real question is whether there's competition. At this table, when Mr. Yoder says something, then Mr. Hightower and Mr. Foreman can reply. When that man puts it at Ms. Foreman, at eye level, there is no competition. The Department of Agriculture isn't there saying, no, don't buy that because. The doctors aren't there saying, no, don't buy that because. There is no answering voice. It's all to one side.
Well, how do you get an answering voice?
Some of the mechanism is already available, potentially in the Congress. 4 years ago, the Congress passed a bill that Senator Schweiker supported, and the President Nixon vetoed it, and finally, 4.5 years later, it may come into being. But it takes a long time, and I'm afraid not enough people are really worried enough about it. It'll take another 10 years.
And I think things like a Consumer Protection Agency that we've had a big battle about.
I'm so glad you raised that.
These are the issues that give us an advocate at levels of decision-making that need to be done.
And let me point out, please, before we go on, that poor piece of legislation crying in the wilderness over 6 years today was...
what piece of legislation?
I'm sorry, the Agency for Consumer Advocacy, which is what this legislation is called now, which would not give the consumer a voice in the marketplace, but would give the consumer a voice in government, so that when the U.S. Department of Agriculture decides to change its beef grading system, that there would be an advocate within the government to present the customer's point of view.
You and Mike?
All of us.
We're all consumers, but you...
only in your consumer role, not in your producer role. To represent those people who purchase things, who are affected by government decisions to raise the price of airline fares or to allow beef grading to change. But today, after many years of a very small minority in the Senate keeping this legislation from passing, the Senate changed its rules, and now we have enough votes to get to kill the filibuster. The President of the United States decided that he really doesn't think this is a good idea.
We have one-man rule here, Ms. Foreman. We're going to move on to the next
No, you have to let me say that the President is now
you got overridden, fellas.
has threatened a veto of this legislation to provide a consumer advocate. So we don't have one in the marketplace or the government.
Which reminds me, we all have images of what hunger and hungry people are. And let's go to our final film now from Christopher Goss, Savannah. This time the subject is hunger, American-type hunger, and what it's all about. This is the third film that Chris, with the help of working with Audrey Rasmussen and Missy Rennie of the Impact staff, did in Savannah.
A starving child like this is rarely seen in the United States. This is the face of hunger in Bangladesh. These are sights that to most Americans represent a condition that surely couldn't exist in our affluent society. But this too is a face of hunger, an American face, a 38-year-old woman who can no longer afford to buy groceries and who is forced to seek what little charity she can find.
Kennedy, I believe you were here last month to see us.
Yes, I was.
And what is the problem today?
Well,
you need food.
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Kennedy.
Until she can get food stamps, this woman in effect is forced to beg for food, a humiliating experience, one that involves her having to explain how she has been surviving before her resources were exhausted.
Oatmeal and stuff, because that's kind of helpful, and then beans and peas and potatoes and stuff like that, and stuff you can season with and try to make biscuits when you don't have enough flour and stuff like that. And then a lot of times I'll get the stuff to cook out the fat with to make the shortening and stuff to use with it.
Mm-hmm. So we'll get you some food from the pantry today.
All right.
Okay.
Hunger in America. No one really knows just how big the problem is, although there's little doubt that millions of Americans are hungry. Estimates range from 20 to 30 million, whose income level is low enough to suggest they cannot afford to buy enough food for an adequate diet. While hunger is the traditional estate of the poor, our soaring unemployment has produced a new generation of hungry families from the ranks of the country's working force, a situation all too reminiscent of the Depression.
We've Hooverized on butter, and for milk we've only water, and I haven't seen a steak in many a day. As for pies, cakes, and jellies, we substitute sow belly, for which we work the county road each day. Oh, those beans, bacon, and gravy, they almost drive me crazy. I eat them till I see them in my dreams when I wake up in the morning and another day is dawning. I know I'll have another mess of beans.
I'd like to apply for food stamps. All right, your name, please. Jacqueline Eccles.
Eccles, E-C-H-O-L-S?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, food stamps, right?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, just have a seat and someone will see you shortly.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I used to have about $40 a week. I could depend on $40 a week. Now I can't depend on more than 25. Sometimes it's less than that.
Ms. Eccles, please.
Mrs. Jacqueline Eccles has 5 children, all under the age of 12. Her husband, Lacey, a construction worker, was laid off just before Christmas. They've been barely scraping by on what few odd jobs he could get. And now, for the first time, Mrs. Eccles finds herself applying for government food stamps to help feed her children.
Ms. Eccles, what we're doing this morning is registering for a food stamp application, and I'll make an appointment with you to see a caseworker.
My 11-year-old wanted to go to church Sunday. Well, he didn't have any shoes. He had sneakers that were falling apart, and he was ashamed to go to church. So I took $11 out of my $40 and bought him a pair of shoes yesterday. And I told Lacey there's no sense in it. You know, when there's people that are willing to help, if you'll just ask, you've got to ask or people don't know that you do need help. And I buy 2 gallons of milk a week. And I have gone to the extreme of adding a quart of water to a gallon of milk to make a little bit more. You know, make 2.5 gallons out of 2 gallons.
Okay, all right, now this is your food stamp application. Fill out all questions. Answer all of them. If they don't apply to you, write no or none. Okay. Now, would you hold on a minute? I'll have to get you registered, all right?
For Mrs. Eccles, this is just the beginning of a long, agonizing, bureaucratic process that represents the federal government's $5 billion a year commitment to help feed America's hungry. The Department of Agriculture estimates that it takes $154 in food stamps each month to support a nutritionally adequate diet for a family of 4. How much they must pay for their stamps depends on the income level and the number of allowable deductions. The formula is designed to make sure that food stamp recipients pay no more than 30% of their income on food. But all this means dozens of documents and lengthy forms that must be examined and verified, a process usually handled by a local administration desperately short of staff and sophisticated equipment. For Mrs. Eccles, it means another visit and another interview.
You have down here that you have a checking account. Which bank is that with?
Savannah Bank.
We make a list of everything you need to bring back. Do you have the rent receipts with you or the utility receipts?
I have them at home.
Okay. Now, we'll need to see the lot receipt and the rent receipt and utility receipts if you have them. This will be anything you pay within the last month.
Federal food stamp regulations require the applications be completed within 30 days. But what happens all too often is that people like Mrs. Eccles and her family, who need food now must wait not just 30 days, but often 45 or even 90 days.
Whichever. I hadn't given it much thought.
Do you wish anyone to purchase the stamps besides yourself and your husband? You've signed the application. Your husband is currently unemployed, and it's yourself and your 5 children in the home. Your husband has been laid off, is that correct? When was he laid off? Has he made an application for unemployment? Do you have any other income besides the unemployment, if you do receive that currently? Do you have any medical bills that you paid within the last month? And you have receipts at home?
The system cannot adequately handle the 18 million Americans now within the program, let alone try to reach some 20 million more Americans who are eligible but don't know it. For those who finally do get their stamps, though, there's yet another bureaucratic process to endure: recertification. About every 1 to 6 months, food stamp recipients must return to the application office to prove once more that they're still eligible. Often this means their stamps are held up for weeks or even months before approval or adjustment of the amount they must pay for the stamps. Food stamps must be paid for in cash.
Oh yeah, $84 in stamps. 40, 80, 82, 84. Thank you.
If the recipient cannot come up with all the cash for her month's supply of stamps, she loses the chance to buy the rest of her monthly allotment. The stamps are as good as money in the grocery store, which means that state sales tax derived from food stamp sales is generating more local revenue, a financial boost that is beginning to persuade many states and counties that the program may be worth supporting and improving.
10, 25, 30. I'm going to take the 32. Do you want to give me the 2 pennies? How many times did you put that on like this? I'll put one time for the 20, one time for 20.
But the stamps will not buy everything on the supermarket shelves. Not allowed are many items that have become almost as essential as food in many American households, like detergent, soap, and paper products. They must be paid for in cash. The food stamp program is undoubtedly bogged down in bureaucracy, which raises the one broad but vital question: are we truly committed to feeding our hungry? James Sumner, director of the county food stamp program that includes Savannah, is one administrator not convinced of that commitment.
This is a very, very difficult question to answer. I think to some extent the food stamp program has enabled people to meet their nutritional needs that would not have otherwise had these met. So from that standpoint, I think it has been a good program. However, I think again we must make that commitment to providing the resources that are necessary to administer the program, or we're going to still have hungry people out there simply because they can't get into the system.
You could probably take it. You could suck on it for a while.
Advertised on television. You could have that.
Well, the problem of hunger is an old problem in America, but I think we can all agree that the paradoxes continue. We're now spending much more to help those who are malnourished than 10 years ago, and yet we still seem to have the problem with us. We talk about a scarcity of food, and yet we waste enough in this country, according to a number of computations, that could really feed almost all the hungry people in the world. I think, Senator Schweiker, I'd like to ask you why you feel, or whether you feel, we are genuinely committed to solving this problem.
Well, I think we've certainly made an impressive start. I can remember when I was a member of the House some years back, and the food stamp plan first came up, and it only passed by a few votes, and I think there were like 7 Republicans, of which I was one who voted for it. And they swore it was socialism at the time, and we had a real battle, and so we had no commitment then. Now it's come a long way since then. So I think we made really great progress since those days, but I think now we're at the point where we're beginning to backtrack and say that somebody else ought to do it, you know, or some other way ought to be done, or something. I happen to feel that we've gotten a good program going, that we've made a commitment here, and that as affluent and wealthy as we are, we ought to keep that commitment. So we've made a good start, but I'm afraid that some of the regulations and some of the budgeting is now swinging in the other direction. I think that is the issue. I just don't see a much better way of doing it than the approach we're taking. I'm sure it can be refined and improved and perfected, but I certainly don't see that we should be abandoning it or detracting from it or regulating it out of business or appropriating it out of business.
Secretary Yider, there's a persistent view among some of the critics of the food stamp program, or some of the supporters of the food stamp program, that the Agriculture Department really does not have its heart in this program.
Well, I don't know whether it has its heart in the program or not, Paul. It sure has its pocketbook in the program. A couple of years ago, the food programs amounted to about a third of the USDA budget. A year or so ago, it amounted to half, and now it's 2/3 and going up. So I don't know how you define heart, Paul, but in terms of both absolute dollars being expended and percentiles in the USDA budget, there are a lot of funds going in this program.
Well, there are people who contend, some of the critics contend, that the Agriculture Department has deliberately devised regulations in such a fashion that it makes it very, very difficult for many of those who deserve and need food stamps to really get the food stamps. In other words, you lay down all kinds of roadblocks instead of holding out a genuinely needed helping hand to these people.
Well, one can always hold out a genuinely needed helping hand if one does not worry about the interests of the man who foots the bill, that is, the American taxpayer. It seems to me that as public servants, the Department of Agriculture or any other department has an obligation to try to give the taxpayer his money's worth. And in this case, it's a matter of trying to make sure that people who receive food stamps are the people who ought to receive food stamps, that people receive what they're entitled to, no more and no less. Now, clearly that's a debatable subject. Mr. Kramer has had many, many debates with the Department of Agriculture on its regulations through the years.
He was
and
one of
many
the
lawsuits against the Department of Agriculture through the years.
He was one of the authors of the original bill.
Not the original bill, but I've done a lot of work on amendments. I think the problem is, as Mr. Yoder stated, it's the pocketbook. It's digging in deep. We have 18.4 million people on at a cost of $5 billion a year. Theoretically, under the guidelines the department itself has said, perhaps as many as 46 million Americans are eligible because they have that little funds vis-a-vis food bills. Even at 24 cents a meal, to feed those 46 million Americans would cost $10 billion, and I don't think anyone is prepared, perhaps not even the Congress, to say go ahead and do that. And so inevitably you get roadblocks. One of the most funny roadblocks is the fact that they don't try to tell the people about the program. A lot of private groups have gotten together and done TV advertising, just like the food companies, and set up phone hotlines. And a couple of weeks ago in the district, Secretary Butts called one of the phone hotlines, made up some income data to see whether he would be eligible. And when told that he was, asked why he hadn't heard of the program before, the answer was that because Secretary Butts doesn't want to let people know the program exists. Ironically, the most advertising he ever did for the program was back in November the department decided to raise the cost of food stamps to people, and particularly the elderly groups. The word got out, and pretty soon everybody in America knew about food stamps because somebody was grabbing to take them away. The best advertising the department ever did was when they tried to take them away from you rather than when they tried to give them.
What's the problem?
Problem is multiple. The problem is the fact that we try to make sure that people eat well, and you miss. There are now, in most people's families could have 4 forms of food money when they go to the food store. A woman can go to the WIC program, which was shown in the earliest film, and there they give you a $20 voucher to buy things like infant cereal and Infamil and orange juice and eggs. Then you can have food stamps. If you buy something with $1.50 that's worth $1.50 and you pay $2 in food stamps, they're not allowed to give you 50 cents change. They got to give you 50 cents IOU. And then finally you have money. So a food stamp mother has to buy things, or conceivably buy things, with 4 kinds of money as opposed to 1. Former Vice President Humphrey last December had an idea that what they ought to do with the food stamp program is set 20% of the stamps aside for meat and dairy. And it passed the Senate, and it almost passed the House. Now, if you can imagine what would happen in the grocery lines of America if, as everybody came up with their groceries, 20% had to be segregated to be sure it was meat and dairy, you would have food riots in the grocery store. We want to force people to eat well, and in so doing, we prevent them from getting anything.
A lot of other people have had those ideas too. Those kinds of things come up about once a year to have different color food stamps, and it goes on and on. But the one comment I would make in response to your suggestion that we don't want to tell anybody about food stamps is that it seems to me the issue goes a lot deeper than that, John, because there are a lot of people at the top end of that 46 million who are never, ever going to go down and ask for food stamps, even if you tell them 25 times a day.
Yeah, it costs too much. There's a lot of pride involved. There are a lot of hurdles. You've got to go to at least 2 or 3 places, first to get certified, then to buy your stamps. The banks make some money on the stamps.
Well, many people in my area of the country, for example, out in the Midwest, have so much personal pride that they're not about to do this. And secondly, income levels, the purchasing power of a given income level varies enormously between whether or not you're living in downtown New York City and out in Eustis, Nebraska. This is one of the problems too. That what you consider to be a poverty level nationwide turns out to be a little more impressive income level than that in a lot of places in the United States.
Direct question, Mr. Yoder. Are you taking the position that, from the Agriculture Department standpoint, that the food stamp program is hunky-dory, that it's working great and no problems?
Oh, no. Any program can be
What do you
improved.
see as the problems?
Well, clearly, it's a gigantic program of national scope, and it involves very difficult and delicate relationships between federal, state, and local bureaucracies. Any program that has that kind of a structural arrangement is going to have innumerable administrative problems, and this one is no different from others. Some have suggested that the solution to that is simply to get rid of food stamps and go to a cash-out program and get away from the bureaucracy.
What about this poor woman we heard on the film just now, asked literally every kind of personal question that you could ask her. She had to have her rent receipts and how much money she have in the bank. I realize, and a lot of other things too.
Sure.
This doesn't bother you. Think this is a legitimate criteria for food stamps,
Absolutely.
right?
It seems to me that unless you want to give food stamps to everybody in the United States who walks in the door, you have to have a criteria that determines whether or not those people are eligible. And one has to know what their income levels are to determine whether or not they're eligible. Otherwise, you're going to have people earning $25,000 a year walking in saying, I'd like food stamps.
But there's another question here, excuse me,
sure.
Moment, Jim, and that is, do we have enough food in this country to really feed everybody who needs it? Seems to me that's the basic point, that certain people in this country, great number of people in fact, just don't get enough to eat. And shouldn't we have really a strong national commitment to see that they get enough to eat?
Oh, we have enough food not only to feed all the people of the United States, but many, many millions around the world as well. And we do it, and we have for many years. We're the leading export nation in the world, of course, so that's not a concern here. We do not have a food problem in the United States. We grow far, far more food than we will ever consume in the United States.
But do we have a food policy itself?
Sure, we have a food policy. Now, people will debate that because many people would like to have a different food policy than what we have, but to suggest that there's no food policy is simply nonsense.
I think you could define it as do something, but not too much if it would cost too much, which is some sort of a policy, but does not solve very many
Do we
problems.
have a food policy which says everybody in the United States should have a square meal all through, all the time?
Oh, I think that's implicit in the laws that have been enacted by the Congress many years back. That's implicit in the food stamp program and school lunch and school breakfast programs and this whole gamut of food programs. There really is no need for anybody in the United States to go hungry at any time for lack of the wherewithal to obtain the food. Now, there are going to be people going hungry here and in other countries around the world every night, whether that wherewithal is there or not, because there are people in the wealthiest families suffering from malnutrition. That's always going to take place. But in terms of a commitment by the government of the United States to have the wherewithal to everybody in the United States to eat a healthy meal tonight, that's there. Now, Mr. Kramer would suggest that not everybody knows about that, and that's probably true. Not everybody does know about it.
Dr. Hegstead, how would you define hunger?
Well, I think hunger would ordinarily be defined as not enough food. Now, that malnutrition may well be something else, which may be the wrong kind of food. I would define a lot of overweight people as malnourished, but they're certainly not hungry. I'd like to ask another question, though, before we get off this. What kind of evidence do we have on the coverage of food stamps at?
That's one of the problems. The General Accounting Office just did a little study of this a couple of months ago and said the department doesn't collect the evidence. I guess, again, because theoretically there are 35 to 45 million people eligible, and if you're only serving half of them, you don't want to collect the evidence that you're missing the other half. For example, there have been fights in various states about putting people in the unemployment offices to tell people coming in for unemployment about food stamps. Instead, we make it, you have to go to 7 or 8 different offices to get information about all the 7 programs. The food stamp program is the second largest program in this country today. It's, I guess, 28 million on Social Security and 18.5 on food stamps. I don't think people understand that the welfare program is nothing anymore. In 1969, President Nixon made a startling pledge on public television to give every family of 4 in America $1,600. In July 1975, the food stamp program will give every family of 4 in America that can make it into the office that has no income $1,944. $344 that Nixon promised. Congress never passed it, and through the back door, the food stamp program has overwhelmed welfare. It's second most, and it shows that I think this country may be ultimately ungovernable. 18 million people is just too many people to administer. We don't have the governmental mechanisms to handle it.
Well, it's gigantic, and it always will be a very serious administrative problem. But I frankly doubt, John, that there are very many people in the United States who are unaware of the existence of food stamps. There are undoubtedly some, but it seems to me that the argument that there are millions of people in the U.S. who have never heard of food stamps is probably a very severe exaggeration.
All right. Is not whether they've ever heard of it, but whether they know the process to go to get them. That's a different question.
Well, that's true, Jim, but the food stamp program, as you probably know, is administered at the local welfare offices, and there are thousands of those in the United States, and you would assume that most people would think about a local welfare office in these terms.
All right.
What must the government do to provide this kind of information nationwide? Now, I suppose you could go to an extreme and hire thousands of people and have them go door to door, but we ought not. There ought to be a better way to do it than that.
All right, lady and gentlemen. I think at this point, for our remaining segment of tonight's dinner, we have heard such a cross-current of viewpoint on all of these subjects that relate to food. I think it might be wise if we tried for the remaining moments to try to define a national food policy and what we need. Where do we go from here? We've had a provocative and interesting discussion of the problems and the policies. Why don't we just go around the table, and I would like to ask each of you what you think we need to do in this country now in the light of all the problems that we've heard. Mike Jacobson.
Well, just dictating a national food policy would be a lengthy affair. The Food Day Project actually wrote up a food policy that's in the book Food for People, Not for Profit. What I'd like to encourage people to do is learn about the problems related to the food supply: hunger, high prices, corporate power, and illnesses related to the foods we're eating. Learn about those problems and then organize groups. Join consumer groups, poverty groups, work locally and work nationally, and begin to do something about them.
Senator Schweiker?
I think that we ought to work up a national food policy that has primary emphasis on nutrition and health. I just don't see a relationship in our food policy today to either nutrition or health. And since this is sort of the end product, so to speak, the end result of what we're trying to accomplish by a food policy, I think this ought to be integrated. And you go to many different agencies and departments, and there's no integrated overall national policy that really relates to nutrition education, health education, and the relationship to disease and health. And I think it's an integrated national policy in the nutrition, health, disease area that we need.
Carol?
Well, I think the lack of a food policy simply points up the feeling of most Americans that the government and business do not represent the typical person's interest anymore, a feeling that we have no ability to have an effect on the way we live and the kind of life that we have. And I think I would go back to first urging citizen action as a method to begin seeking a greater representation at the local level, and then at the federal level, more representation of the individual's point of view in the decision-making process within not just the Congress, we have some input there, but within federal agencies, and some mechanism for an individual input into the decision making within corporations.
Jim Hightower?
I think that basically questions of nutrition and price and all other factors that we discussed tonight come down to the structure of the food economy, and we've got to begin to deal with that, because that is essentially a monopolistic economy, and that is where we get the bad nutrition that we're increasingly getting and the high prices. I think we've got to cope with that. I think that that is not an economic question, but a political question, and that farmers and consumers and workers in the food economy have to begin to get together and to fight that political battle against the corporations that are now entrenched here in Washington, D.C., and in the capitals, to begin to take over their government and to begin to fight back against that power.
What are you suggesting, though, in terms of a food policy?
I think at the very least we've got to deal with antitrust. We've got to enforce the antitrust laws, period, not by consent decree.
Laws that are already on the books.
Already on the books. And I think we've got to move to some alternatives, give people alternatives like cooperative marketing systems in cities to counter the supermarket concentration in a lot of our cities. I think we've got to we've got to have a Family Farm Act in this country that prohibits conglomerate takeover.
What's so bad about that?
It eliminates the competitiveness, the efficiency, the productivity of our food economy over the years has come from the family farm. And now we're going to allow these corporations, just by sheer raw financial power, to take that over. The least efficient, the least competitive, the least productive sector of our economy to take over the most productive, efficient, and competitive. That makes no sense. I think we've got to have a Family Farm Act that makes sense. I think we've got to have tools of access, like Carol was talking about, like the Consumer Protection Agency that allows consumers access into this. So I think solutions such as that are possible, but it basically comes down to the political power to enact those.
John Kramer.
The part of the food policy I'm concerned about is that the federal government really resolved to be generous in treating its own people and the people of the world who are hungry in a reasonable way. And at home, that means an adequate income maintenance policy, slowly replacing the
What do you
food stamp
mean, an
program.
adequate income maintenance policy?
That's the tough word, because inadequate, you obviously start at least $1,944 if you just cash in the food stamps.
Well, let me ask you, are you talking about what the economists call a guaranteed annual income?
Yes, but at a level sufficient so that nobody loses what they now have, which is quite a lot when you add a lot of benefits like food stamps and unemployment compensation and other things together. Overseas, I think it's about time we started to resolve that we will feed the hungry overseas. Not simply, as Secretary Kissinger has, that we will feed the hungry in South Vietnam and South Korea, but also worry a little bit about Pakistan and Bangladesh. And I think that there are agricultural policies in the United States contributing to grain reserves and other things that could accomplish that and indeed promote the interests of the American farmer at the same time. What I'm worried about is that the food stamp program spends more time knocking the hands away of those who might be fraudulent instead of giving to those who are in need.
John, there's a good bit of food aid going to Pakistan and Bangladesh right now.
Yeah, but only because Congress mandated that and made you stop giving it to South Vietnam and South Korea.
That's not so.
Mr. Tatum, you're on, Mr. Tatum.
I certainly agree with the Senator that the questions of nutrition and health are very important to our nation. The mechanism in which this is imposed, if you pardon the word, but is disseminated, I think should come from perhaps government action, but using the resources that we have, not pseudo-resources, and what is known as the truth in this rather infant area that we are involved in today. And I would like to say, and I presume you would all expect me to say it, that I feel that the food industry as a whole in the United States, regardless of what you say, Jim, that they have done a damn good job of feeding the nation of the United States.
Mr. Yider.
Well, there are really three pieces to this: production, marketing, and consumption. On the production side, it's a matter of making sure farmers produce the food, because all that we've said here tonight is just sheer rhetoric unless it gets produced. So you've got to have a farm policy in this country that will provide incentives for farmers to produce. And we've made a lot of progress in the last 5 or 6 years to move away from those old production constraint programs that kept land out of production and paid farmers to not to farm. So that's the first key. The second one, of course, is the marketing process, which really gets back to Jim's point and others, that we've got to have a competitive marketing environment all the way from the producer to the consumer, and an efficient one. And there are probably times in the history of this country and today in which that hasn't always been the case. We need to make sure that it is the case. And then on the consumption side, we do get in the matter of having an effective understanding of consumers of what it is that they're buying.
Dr. Hegstad?
Well, I'd like to mention one thing that hasn't been discussed, and that refers to nutrition research, which we need some policy on that, because the questions that everyone asks always come back to how much do you know about these diseases and the relation to nutrition. And I certainly think a national policy has to include that. I agree with the Senator, but I also agree with you. We obviously do have a food and nutrition policy. The only trouble is we don't know what it is. And
I know what it is.
I think I'm not sure you know what the nutrition policy is. I think we need to begin by having an agency that at least is responsible for evaluating what we're doing and what impact laws and suggestions of laws have on food and nutrition. I think if we had an agency that analyzed what's going on and what is proposed, that this then would lead us into a food and nutrition policy. Because when we try to define it in general terms, that everybody ought to be well fed, everybody had an adequate diet, everybody agrees with that. The only trouble is we don't know how to accomplish it. And I think the place to begin is at least to have somebody responsible for defining what we're doing and of analyzing the impacts of various things that are going on.
How would you suggest that it be accomplished? How do you make people, that's the word, make people, the term make people eat well?
Well, I think there are limits there, and I'm not willing to shove it down their throat either. I think
well, as you can tell, the controversy and the conversation is certain to go on for a long time. When we began this program 2 hours ago, we said we hope to provide you with some revealing facts about the food problems in this country. We hope we've succeeded. We hope we've provided more enlightenment than confusion. And most of all, we hope we may have succeeded in making you nutritionally wiser. We also hope you've enjoyed the last American supper. For all of our guests here at the table, for Jim Lara, for myself, I'm Paul Duke. Good night.
In America, you get food to eat. You don't have to run through the jungle and scuff up your feet. You just sing about Jesus and drink wine all day. It's great to be an American.
Gonna start the day the right way, the old way, the get up and go way. Gonna have a bowl of limo.
And these high sugar baby foods are produced only to get more
talk in an animated way.
I have an important thing I found out now, which is who lives in my neighborhood. Going up Connecticut Avenue.
And
the candy bars serve any useful purpose?
Well, I wouldn't throw candy bars off the market.
It's squiggly wiggly. It's quite something I've never seen.
I don't think they're as bad, but that is, you know, we're gonna take what you believe.
It feels like it ought to make us
It gets down to
music,
you know, be a political battle.
I don't want that in my hand.
When we pass the mints around.
All that sugar?
Sugar in there.
In there. I shouldn't take one. I will, though.
What?
You came out on behalf of labor. I thought that was very good.
Yeah, you.
I'm tired.
You represented your constituency very quickly there, Karen.
I'm tired of that canard. I really am. The idea that a labor increase can go up 8% when the cost of living is going up.
Production funding provided by public television stations, the Ford Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. This has been a production of NPACT, a division of GWETA.